All right, everyone. Thank you so much for coming and stopping by my talk on the many shipwrecks that we can find in our local lake of Lake Ontario. So, my name is Igor Polotai, and I am currently working for this research company called Exploring on Deep World, and our whole mission is to really get to the bottom of what's at the bottom. So, if you have seen me, I have a table set up in the lobby where you can learn more about the shipwreck of Lake Ontario. But this presentation should give you an overview of what's down below and what's so interesting about the area that we live in. So I like to start everything with a quote, and the quote that best fits this is Robert Wyland's, "The finest wilderness is what's beneath the wave." And that's true because underneath the waves is more biodiversity than you can find almost anywhere on Earth. So we're going to be talking about how shipwrecks form, how we find them, and what's so special specifically about Lake Ontario. So let's get started with basics. So a little bit more about our company. So we are a non-profit research company that's all about exploring the oceans and the deep waters for the public good. So we do projects all over the world, from Lake Ontario to the Dead Sea in Israel to submarine research in the Canary Islands. All over the world, we have different projects going on, and our goal is to find cool stuff and show it to the public. And as you can see, there's a lot of water for us to go through, so we're pretty busy. And so we do a whole lot from, this is a boat that we use for Lake Ontario. We also do cave diving in Mexico. We find different ships using underwater drones, some of which you can see at our table. We use sonar to find those ships. And we also play with submarines. So this is the Pisces submarine that is currently in the Canary Islands that we are working with. And of course, who doesn't like killer whales? So this is us taking pictures of the killer whales in the Florida Keys. So, how do we get shipwrecks? Well, for a shipwreck to happen, you have to have a ship that sinks. And there's only one way for a ship to sink, and that's through water. But there's a lot of ways that water can actually get into a ship. And so, by looking at a shipwreck, you can sometimes figure out and reverse engineer the cause of why that shipwreck actually sunk. And it can happen for a variety of reasons, through bad weather and the high waves, fire, explosions, collisions. Sometimes a cannonball went through the hull. Sometimes a torpedo hit it. And generally those leave marks that are left on the shipwrecks. And so after a ship sinks, what happens to it really depends on where it sank and the type of water it sunk in. The main two factors are how deep it went and also how cold the water is. So for example, the Endurance here is Shacklemore's ship that he went to Antarctica on, and that sank very deep into the frigid waters of the Antarctic. And so that ship is very well preserved because pretty much nothing that can decompose the ship can survive so deep and so cold waters. On the other hand, you have ships like the New Orleans, which is in more shallower and more warmer waters, and so that ship is much more decayed. And so when we think about shipwrecks, they act in very similar ways to how whales work or other large fish and mammals that die. And they become a sort of ecosystem by themselves. So they become artificial reefs and they host a ton of different animals. So everything from crustaceans to plankton to different bacteria, all the way to fish and even sharks and jellyfish can find their home in shipwrecks. And in Lake Ontario, there are many different fish that like to school around them, and actually we can use the different fish that like to use shipwrecks as a way of guiding us to shipwrecks, because usually they don't stick around in the bottoms of the lake unless there's a reason for them to do so. So when we are diving down to the bottom of the lake and we see big groups of fish, that's a pretty good indicator that there's probably a shipwreck close by, or those groups of fish wouldn't be down below. But in addition to native animals that use shipwrecks, there's also a lot of invasive animals that also like to use shipwrecks. And the big problem, invasive species specifically for Lake Ontario, is the quagga mussel. Now, the quagga mussel is similar to the zebra mussels, but they are two different types of mussels. But the quagga mussel is an invasive species that filters out water through, and lays at the bottom, and also coats all of these shipwrecks. Now, you might think that these mussels that filter out water is a good thing, because it makes the water clearer and you can see deeper into it, and it removes a lot of the algae and all the muck that can be in the water. But it actually is very harmful, because a lot of native animals and species rely on all of the algae and all of the growth that exists in the water to live. And so when these quagga mussels filter out all the water and make it super clear, it really harms the native species. And you can see here in this diagram of Lake Michigan that these quagga mussels have just absolutely taken over the Great Lakes. There's about a quadrillion of them in just Lake Ontario. That is 127,000 times more than all of the humans in the entire globe. And that's only in one of the Great Lakes. And so they've become a big ecological nightmare for us to deal with. So it's important, if there's one thing for you to take away from this presentation, it's important that you know your role in stopping invasive species from entering our water. So if any of you here are boaters or like to swim or otherwise use the lake, make sure you are following good guidelines for cleaning your equipment, whether it's boats or boots or anything that make contact into the water, because these quagga mussels got into the lake by sticking to the bottoms of ships that came from Europe. And so you might not think that this is important, but you don't know if you are transferring from one body of water to another, what might be stuck to the bottom of your shoe or to your swim trunks that might decades later cause untold ecological damage to the lake. So let's talk about the shipwrecks of Lake Ontario a bit more. So Lake Ontario has a lot of different shipwrecks. They have an estimated 500 shipwrecks, from small tugboats all the way to big battleships. It also contains the world, or America's oldest shipwreck, the HMS Ontario, but we'll get to that in a bit. But there are two key zones for the shipwrecks in Lake Ontario. The first is the Marine Sanctuary. This is protected by NOAA, the National Ocean Administrative Authority, and they kind of supervise all of the waters and shipwrecks, and they created a sanctuary zone to protect all of these different shipwrecks. Now, unofficially, there's also this Marysburg Vortex, which is kind of the Bermuda Triangle of Lake Ontario. So there's a lot of different ghost stories and unexplained sightings and disappearances that have happened here for a variety of reasons that we haven't figured out, but different theories from the magnetic readings being off in this region to a comet hitting this and this being a large impact crater, all the way up to aliens, all try to explain why this area, specifically of Lake Ontario, is so rich in shipwrecks and also crashed airships. There's about 80 to 100 different shipwrecks that have crashed in just this triangle region. And so when we think about the types of shipwrecks that you can find at the bottom of the lake, it mostly comes down to these wooden sail ships. These are the most common types of ships that you can find at the bottom of the lake, and that's because the heyday of Lake Ontario trading was back when Rochester was a large port city, the Erie Canal was just built, so the 1700s and the 1800s were really the strongest time for Lake Ontario shipping. And then, as we expanded west and built more ocean ports, trade across Lake Ontario decreased. But for this reason, we find a lot of shipwrecks from the 1800s and the late 1700s at the bottom, and they're mostly these wooden ships. Specifically, the most common type of ship are the schooners, which are the two-mast ships that comprise the majority of the trading vessels back in the day. So now let's go over a couple of my favorite shipwrecks. So this is the HMS Ontario, and this is the oldest shipwreck in America. This sunk in the middle of the 17th century, and this was recently found, and so this is a British warship, and most of the equipment on it is still there. There's also the Coast Guard, and this is a more modern vehicle that sunk to the bottom and sunk in a way that it's actually almost vertical to the bottom of the floor, because it is considerably heavier on one side of the ship than the other, and so it's currently lying at a 45-degree angle to the sea bottom, which you'll see as we zoom out here. And this was filmed with our 5-fish underwater drone. That one can go 100 meters underwater, and this is located about 70 feet underwater. Yep, so it's covered in quagga mussels all the way up, and they really do coat like every part of the ship. Next is the Bavaria. This is a schooner ship. Now this technically did not sink, but this is one of the most common of the ghost stories. So this ship was discovered ashore on an island, but the entire crew went missing. And so the ship was intact and all of their stuff was still on the ship, but the entire crew just disappeared unexpectedly and they were never seen again. And a similar story went with the Picton, which is another schooner ship. Now this isn't the Picton shipwreck, this is the Katy, which is a different schooner, because the Picton has never been found. But what happened with the Picton is that they went ahead into stormy waters, and the ships it was traveling with did not spot it, and the Picton sunk. But a week after the Picton sank, a message in a bottle washed up on shore with a message from the ship's captain telling the message that the captain tied a rope around him and his son so that they could be found together. Now, when the captain found time to actually write this message, put it in a bottle, throw it overboard, and actually tie himself, allegedly, to his son, while the Picton went rapidly down, is unknown even to this day. And as I've said, the Picton has never been found, so this is another one of the ghost mysteries that has persisted. And so, finally, how do we actually find these shipwrecks? Well, we use a combination of two things. The first thing that we use is sonar. Sonar is waves of sound that we bounce off the seafloor in order to get images of whatever is underneath. And you can see in this image, this is a ship that we found using sonar at a depth of 200 feet underwater. And once we do find the ship underwater, then we use underwater drones, also known as remote operated vehicles, also known as ROVs, and this actually allows us to go all the way to the bottom and take some video and photos of what we see. And this ROV is special because this is the ROV that went and explored the Titanic shipwreck on the Nautilus ship. And so we have similar, though less expansive versions that we use on a daily basis. So that's it for my presentation. If you have any questions, let me know. If not, please check out my exhibit in the lobby area, and I hope you enjoy the last day of PirateFest. Thank you, everyone.
Yay.